Okay, right. Here I am with Dr. Carl Griffin of the University of Sussex. We're here, as you've just noticed, having a quiet beer in a very nice bar in London. Cheers, Carl. To talk about some of the work you guys have been doing. Firstly, around moral economy. Now, as we all know, Carl, moral economy is this major thesis that is kind of seen as this milestone really in protest studies. But it's quite old now, 1970s. What relevance can it possibly have for studies today, would you say?
That's a really interesting question. I think without doubt the moral economy thesis that Thompson proposed in that seminal paper in Past and Present, now over 40 years ago, is still kind of relevant in a number of ways. Now, firstly, it's been taken up really from kind of the early 1980s and continuing through to this day by scholars in anthropology, explorations and development studies, and they've taken kind of Thompson's work off in interesting kind of new directions, not least and perhaps most seminally through kind of the anthropologist Jim Scott and his translocating Thompson's thesis from the marketplaces of 18th century England to the rubber plantations of southeastern Asia. And I think those kind of interesting, kind of suggestive ways in which the concept has been reimagined and kind of reappropriated in different spatial and temporal contexts has kind of implications for the way in which historians might think about moral economy today. The second is that the Thompson's thesis has taken on a life of its own and has been applied in all sorts of kind of other contexts, particularly by political scientists, economists and economic geographers, trying to understand the role of kind of ethics, the role of values in global economic systems.
Is that an entirely good thing, though? Is that not, is that what Thompson really wanted for his thesis, do you think?
Well, again, interesting question here. Thompson's kind of rejoined both to the critics of his kind of moral economy thesis and to those who sought to kind of translocate it from the 18th century English marketplace. Suggests that he was a little bit prickly. This kind of proud kind of owner of the concept, kind of wary that it had taken on a life beyond its father. I'm not so sure that we should be quite so precious about concepts. I mean, as with any theory, we need to think about what work they can do in helping us to kind of understand the world, both kind of past and present. And I think kind of what the moral economy has kind of taken on, this life beyond 18th century England, is really suggestive. However, I still think it has great intellectual value and great power in kind of understanding kind of broader processes in 18th and 19th century Britain and Ireland. So there's not been a great deal of work, for instance, recently on the tradition of food writing. John Boast has continued to work in this area, and his important but in many ways kind of a mixed received book published in 2010, Politics of Provisions, has suggested there's kind of much work still to be done. But beyond that, this kind of original focus is has quieted down a little bit. Other scholars have sought to use the concept to understand broader kind of work relations and social and cultural relations, not least in the countryside. A really interesting piece by Peter Jones, in Social History in 2006, sought to use the concept to explain the background to the swing riots of 1830. What we mustn't forget, and what Thompson kind of reminded us in his 1992 rejoinder in Customs and Common, is to remember this is kind of a value system. And as with all value systems, you need to think about the context in which those values are kind of created, what kind of informs those values, and how they continue to be creatively performed by all parties involved. So not just a tool, in thinking about what the pool do. It's a tool helping to understand broader social relations, to understand the attitudes of the poor to dispossess in relation to authority.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? It's too easy to imagine this as a provenance only of the ruled, but actually the rulers they have a role to perform here as well, do they not?
Oh, quite, and this is one of the areas in which I think it would be fair to say that work on particularly rural protest has not satisfactorily kind of grasped that angle of kind of Thompson's thesis. So there's been much work in the 80s, 90s, and again there's been recent reawakening of interest in rural protest. It's very much going to focus upon practices, upon the doings of protest, to an extent as well kind of the geographies, the diffusion of protest. After the seminal work of that great University of Gloucester scholar Andrew Charlesworth. But work looking at kind of the reaction of kind of authorities, this conversation, this interplay, or even in the words of Andrew Charlesworth, the stately gavotte between the protesters, between the authorities, and in the context of the 18th century market, the dealers, the middlemen, the bakers, the millers, and so on and so forth. That degree of complexity is something that perhaps is kind of lacking in some recent work.
So, turning to recent work and your own, really impressive stuff. Your corpus of work is really out there, Carl. Where do you see moral economy helping you, hindering you? Where do you see you yourself engaging with moral ecology in your own work?
That's kind of a thorny question. I suppose I do it in two ways. First of all, is in the way in which is now almost kind of law for any kind of scholars of protest. It's simply kind of doff your hat to Thompson to acknowledge the huge kind of intellectual importance, the genesis of this concept in much kind of recent work. The second way is perhaps a little more immediate, and that's in some of the work I'm doing at the minute, which is kind of returning to the actions, to the protests, the performances of dissent in the marketplace, and more generally around kind of issues to do with food retailing and food regulation. So I'm looking at, for instance, the use and the mobilisation of the idea of hunger in the 18th, early 19th century. Because Thompson, in his moral economy thesis, suggested that the poor were not necessarily motivated by hunger. Indeed, he was not interested in hunger, but rather, when hungry, what do poor people do?
Yes.
What are the values that informs their actions when they are going without, when their families are going without? But nevertheless, the archives highly could have suggested that the idea of hunger, indeed starvation, was often mobilised by 18th and 19th century food protesters. So what are the values which kind of underpin that mobilisation of the idea, that language, the discourse of hunger, those claims to starvation, and why might they be used by individuals who were not necessarily yet starving? So that's kind of the key way in which it informs what I do.
So do you see paternalism as a concept that might be useful here, or even available to the rulers and the ruled in their performances in the 19th century, in the way it would have been much earlier on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to go back to that kind of example, some of the work I'm currently doing, paternalism is important because the language claims, the language plays made by protesters over ideas of kind of hunger and starvation are attempts, they are pleas directly to their social betters, to the authorities, to try and invoke in them some paternal feeling, to try and get them to remind them of their responsibilities to the poor, as kind of underwritten by the Tudor books of orders, which Thompson suggested underpinned those kind of 18th century moral economy claims. So paternalism is important, but it's kind of the language which is used by the poor to try and invoke paternalism and really get it.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And this is my final question because we're definitely running out of time. But you talked about Andy Charlesworth's work there and this idea of the stately gavotte, and listening to you talk about paternalism there, it seems to me a really important question, and one that we don't have time to debate. Is the question of to what extent people believed in what they were doing, or were they simply playing a game? Are we going to Scott's hidden transcripts here as much as anything? The front of house performance and the back of house performance in the language that people used.
I think that's a really interesting and really suggestive question. I mean, this necessarily kind of gets at the heart of what the archive represents, because it's fundamentally kind of a philosophical question.
Sorry.
We need to kind of dive into kind of much of the work of kind of the post-structuralist kind of French philosophy to try and think about kind of the importance of claims to truth that the archive is being made. But beyond that, if we leave those kind of thorny debates aside,
please do,
at least for now, then I think it's important for us to understand, to realise that to protest in whatever form was always to risk being chastised, to risk being kind of to be marginalised, to be punished. So whether it was even kind of a simple act of foot dragging in the workplace, kind of an act of kind of obviously feigning and performing deference, kind of let alone an act of physical, collective, bodily kind of assertion, setting fire to a hayrick, to protest capital risks. So there had to be kind of meaning behind it. There had to be kind of real will, real intent. And of course, that's not to say that in kind of grand events there might necessarily be kind of an ebullient of feeling. That individuals might not necessarily get kind of caught up in kind of the atmosphere, the emotion of an event of a day, where they won't necessarily be kind of directly kind of following the objectives of those who may have instigated the protest, but rather kind of used it for their own ends, to seek redress, to have fun as well, for broader kind of ends of psychological release. But the idea of kind of a hidden transcript, that behind these kind of outward performances is kind of necessarily kind of useful too, for the archive can't record all of the meanings involved in an event, can't record all of the meanings kind of invested in the poor's use of language. And we necessarily think creatively to read against the grain in the archive, to think how we might kind of interpret the bare bones that we are given.
Well, as ever with every conversation, Carl, that's raised as many questions as it's produced answers. But we've run out of time, so that's really fantastic.
It's a shame, Ian.
But thank you very much, and we'll come back for part 2 at another time. Thank you.
Good stuff.